welcome to the continuation of Wild Times. Ask yourself if, when you were a child, if you had any experience like this. I'm going to tell you my experience. I had two experiences as a very small child where we all have to get our bearings. You're born, your parents are trying to nurture and care for you, explain things to you, but we are come into the world with a capacity to try to get our bearings, from babies to toddlers to 8 and 9-year-olds to teenagers to 21-year-olds. And we have to try to figure out what's going on, and of course people tell us what the story is here, and we generally accept that. There were two experiences I had as a child which were really very important to me. The first one was I grew up in a fairly tight-knit Roman Catholic community, fairly observant parents, fairly traditional, nothing particularly extreme one way or another, but very observant. And I discovered when I went to school as a first grader, we didn't have kindergarten, I discovered that there were other religions. And the discovery was worrying. It was upsetting because although they may not have explicitly communicated it to me, there was a way in which I learned, just as a 6-year-old, going to church, hearing people talk, that other religions were wrong and that they could be dangerous, and that one had to struggle against them in some way. I'm not going to say anything more about that, but that was the first one. The second one was the discovery that there was something called war, where people organized and killed one another. It wasn't as though somebody got mad and lost their temper and hit somebody. It's that people planned to do this and they killed each other. Did anybody have an experience of saying, what's going on here? Now, rapidly, that experience is going to disappear pretty quickly because adults are going to say, well, this is the way it is, and we don't want to go to war, but those bad people want to attack us, so we have to defend ourselves. Which is still the current explanation that is still given to people all over the world. Whether you're here or whether you're in Iran, the bad people who are trying to hurt you just happen to be the other guy. The reason I mention it is because I think there's evidence, and I take it as my own experience, and I hope yours too, that we don't necessarily come into the world with a predisposition to be violent. It has to be, in some sense, activated. We have capacities in our genetic makeup that can hook in and orchestrate our social behavior so that if we are in a society that's struggling against another society, we will plug into it. But on the other hand, it could possibly be activated in a different way. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. So that was the second discovery, the discovery of war. And I guess I should say that it's been with me ever since as a question of what is going on here. So in this topic today, which is about the decline of violence and the evolution of civil society, it's in some ways, I think, a very positive and a very hopeful development. And I hope to convey that to you. So our approach in this Wild Time series is to, again, kind of pull back from what's currently going on. Right now there's a civil war in other people, there are various conflicts going on in small scales all over. They are, for the most part, quite small. But we're not going to dwell on that right now. We're going to pull back, and we're going to try to take a perspective in which we know we are an evolving species. All of life is evolving. The time scale for genetic evolution is quite long. It takes hundreds of thousands of years to make any kind of significant change. But once certain things come into being, they can then change more quickly on shorter time scales and do things that they weren't necessarily to be, things that were not necessarily capable of to begin with. So we're going to take that longer view. The evolutionary view that we obviously evolved some very violent behavior. Why did it come into being is the question I want to ask. And how do we understand it? So, how do I advance the slides?
Is there a clicker there?
I don't see a clicker.
Well, we can advance them.
Would you mind doing that for me?
Not at all.
Oh, we need a slide. We need a remote. It's on the. Oh, okay. Thank you. Sorry.
Now, if you're like me, you can't point at this screen. You have to point at
right.
the thing.
Okay. So, in our current environment, I have had occasion to hear people say that the modern era is the most violent in human history, and they will point to the attack on the World Trade Center, the Second World War, the First World War, Islamic radicals beheading people, and so on. And we have this from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a French philosopher of the late 18th century, who said, "Nothing can be more gentle than man in his primitive state." And there is a belief that some people have that we were a very peaceful species originally. And in fact, progress has been really quite the opposite. The Industrial Revolution, the development of science and technology, in fact, are the cause. Some people actually think that science and technology are the cause of a very violent present. And they will point to the atomic bomb, and my dear friend Anna will point to the invention of the death camp in the Holocaust in the Second World War, and offer that as evidence of how violent things are. So I want to first of all look at the archaeological record and observations about the primitive state. What is this primitive state? So we're going to look at pre-state societies, hunter-gatherers, and we have excavations that go back 10,000 years that have increasingly been done by forensic anthropologists who dig up graves and examine many thousand-year-old bones and can tell how people died. For example, if there's an arrowhead embedded in the skeleton, you kind of get an idea of how that person died. So I'm not going to go into detail about this, but this is just an excavation from the 14th century in South Dakota. These are Native Americans. This was obviously a very big confrontation between two American Indian tribal nations that fought it out, and there were about 500 casualties that occurred that were thrown in pits, including men, women, and children. This is Native American. Now this is an actual record photograph taken in the New Guinea highlands in the 20th century I don't know who took them. I should find out more about it. But these are two tribes in the New Guinea Highlands in the 20th century, hunter-gatherer tribes, who are fighting over territory. And you see the two sides more or less arrayed. Here's one side. Here's the battle line. Come on, red dot, where are you? So here's the battle line, roughly right in here. And this is all done at very close range. And the weapons are clubs and spears. And I think many of you probably know that human males can throw far more accurately than human females. Females can't throw accurately, but males can throw accurately. Where do you think we got that skill? I think it's very clear that we got that skill because of our ancestors who had to do this, throw clubs and spears. That's why you can throw baseballs today. And thank God that's what we're throwing today, rather than clubs and spears. So, the other thing I want to, well, we'll come back to this. I could go on and on with more examples, but I want to look now at some numbers, the actual record. So let's first of all think about the repertoire of violence, and I've just grouped it into three categories. There's first of all war and genocide, and they often, for our ancestors, went together. When the Mongols swept across Asia and almost into Europe in the 13th century, they not only fought with people, they executed them all. The men were all executed whenever they defeated a city. And of course, the women were all taken to be the new wives of the victors. There's also homicide within the society itself. Within the tribe, there can be homicide. It's not as though these pre-state societies were completely peaceful within the tribe. There could be arguments and fights inside the tribe. Again, greatly reduced compared to the fights with the others, but they did occur. So there's homicide, which occurs within the tribe, rather than war, which occurs outside the tribe. There's also torture, atrocity, and cruel punishment. And I'll explain why these seem to have come into being. These are things that people do to one another that seem gratuitous. It seems, why do you have to do that? If you're going to execute somebody, why do you torture them first? And finally, slightly different dimension, but this is also quite universal among in Homo sapiens, is slavery. Some peoples enslave other peoples. So that's the sort of major categories. So the first thing we could look at are deaths from war. And this is a compilation. I'm sorry the print is so fine here, but we're looking at quite a lot of stuff. At the top of the list, because it's very familiar, is the Second World War. And over here, and this is the death toll that actually took place in the war, and over here is the correction for the mid-20th century equivalent. And the reason we have a correction is because we're trying to calculate the deaths on a per unit basis, on the size of the population. If you just calculate absolute values, you're kind of floating around. You don't know quite how to rate it, whether it's a big loss or a little loss. So if you divide the deaths by the size of the population, you get a more realistic number. And you can also then correct it for when we have a population typical of the mid-20th century, and what that number would be were it to happen today. So 55 million, Second World War. The Mongol conquest that I was talking about in the 13th century corrected for today, or for the mid-20th century, 278 million. Way, way more than the Second World War. Something that most people aren't familiar with is a revolt that took place in China in the 8th century between several different principalities. These were different powerful warlords and their constituencies that were struggling with each other. It wasn't just one against another. There were 3 or 4 of them fighting each other. And it was a very unstable and very violent period in China that lasted for about 20 years. It's called the An Lushan Revolt. So this is almost the top number, almost 500 billion. Or 429 million today, would be almost the world population. But there's some, you don't have to take that number, and I think that these numbers are slightly high for this Lushan Revolt. Cut it by a factor of 10, it's still huge. It's still very big. And then over here is another warlord, Timur, Tamerlane, also raged across Central Asia, 14th and 15th century, about 100 million. And then there are other things here, like the Mideast slave trade, pretty big numbers, 132 million. The numbers on the right here are the ranking of what was the most war deaths, and then the second, and so on. The fall of Rome is 5th with 105 million, and so on. But the Second World War is number 9. It's not number 1. Now, this is probably going to be a hard chart to read, so I'm going to try to describe it to you in words of what's going on here. Up on the top, we have a whole bunch of hunter-gatherer societies, non-state societies, and down in the bottom are state societies. These are fairly modern societies. And these range from American Indians, American native populations, Southeast Asia, African, New Guinea, Australia, Amazon, and so on. The Anagamese, which are in the Indian Ocean. So up here is the number of war deaths per 100,000 people. So there was a kind of violent clash of American Indians in a place in California in the 1840s that was recorded. This was probably not a very big population, so it doesn't rate very high. But in terms of the percentage of people that were killed, it's very high. And then we have places in New Guinea coming down, Fiji, Africa, and so on, all plotted on here. Here's the average for 27 non-state, or if you like, primitive societies. It's still pretty big. It's like 500 per 100,000. And now here we have central Mexico, about the time of Columbus. A pretty big number. Then here's Germany in the 20th century, Russia 20th century, France 19th century. These are all fairly recent. We come down here, U.S. war deaths in the 20th century. The world in 2005, battle deaths. You can't even see it. So there's been, from primitive societies down to state societies, a very big decrease. Now the other thing is about homicides. Just people killing each other inside the society. That also has come down. Here we're looking at, again, now the homicides per 100,000 people, starting back in the year 1200 and going to the year 2000. And also, these are not numbers from 1200. These are just the present numbers for non-state societies. These are the Inuit, which are polar Eskimos. These are the Kungsan, which are an African tribe, and these are the Semai. And these numbers are in the range of like 100 per 100,000. And then here's plotted Western Europe. You can see that it's steadily declining. There's a little bit of an increase here. But on the whole, the thing to take a very big note of is this scale is called a logarithmic scale. Each one of these marks, this is 1, this is not 2, this is 10. This is not 3, this is 100. So these are very big jumps. So we're falling from something like 70 to 80 per 100,000 for these non-state societies and for Western societies back in the 13th century. And then they fall to where we're almost down to the level of 1. This is a factor of 2 orders of magnitude. Even if you want to correct it, and you can push the number of homicides up and argue, the decline is very hard to argue away. Here's a little more detail showing the various countries, how homicide rates declined in important European countries. And you can see this fall from high rates down to low rates, more or less in the 1 to 2 range, from the 60 to 70 range. Now, something else in our list doesn't quite fit in with warfare, but it's part of human violence, is torture. And what's happened with torture? Well, in the 17th century, torture was still a very big deal. And so 16 major European regions and countries still had very high rates of torture. And then as we get to the 19th century, things begin to very dramatically fall until we get to the end of the 19th century. Now, does that mean torture completely disappeared? No, it doesn't. It just means that there wasn't a state set of laws and regulations about how you do torture, how you manage it, what the torture will be for the particular crimes. The torture would then be just done by the police, doing it as they saw fit, not necessarily following the law. And that still happens a lot in many parts of the world. The other thing that's kind of interesting is slavery. So, what began to happen from the 17th century on is that some countries began to abolish slavery. And so what's being plotted here is the number of countries that have abolished slavery against time. And you see that there's not much happening till about the 19th century. And then it starts to just generally rise through the 19th century to the point now where slavery, I think the last country to abolish slavery was Mauritania in 1997, maybe, something like that, not very long ago. So one naturally wants to ask the question, how did this happen? And I'd like to see if we can get a little bit of insight about that. I want to bring to you Thomas Hobbes, a British philosopher of the 17th century who wrote, "The state of nature is a war of all against all." And he writes, if we just have people in a society having to negotiate and deal with one another themselves, what you find is that there's no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain, not culture, no navigation, nor the use of commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, because you've got to get a lot of people together to help to move things with force, and you can't do that because everybody's fighting. And so on. So, in short, it's a terrible time. There's no society, continual fear, danger of violent death, and the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So that's Hobbes. And he said something needs to be done about this. And he conceived of how, in the natural state, human beings could be brought to cooperate and cut back on violence. So, to motivate that, I'm going to talk, this is really what I call the hard road to cooperation and peace. So to motivate that, I'm going to talk about what I think is probably one of the most important little mathematical models of the 20th century. It's fairly recent. It's called the pacifist's dilemma. And here's what it's about. Let's just imagine that we're us, and there are those others over there. So we just have two contending parties, us and them. If you will think of it this way, us are going to be over here, and them are up here. Now what this is about is we're going to collide with each other. We're going to come into interaction with each other. And we have two choices. We can, when we come into interaction with the others, we can be aggressive. We can go to war with them, defeat them, take their land, take their possessions, take their women, and that's a possible course of action. The other course of action is to take the pacifist role. We can refuse to do that. We are not going to be aggressive, we're going to be pacifist. Now, the other has exactly the same symmetrical set of choices. They can be aggressive, or they can be pacifist. And so, if you examine what happens when you collide, there's going to be four different situations. We can be aggressive, and they can be aggressive. We can be aggressive, and they can be pacifist. We can be pacifist, and they can be aggressive, and we can both be pacifist. So those are the four, and that exhausts all the possibilities. And that's what this little chart, that's what this little set of four boxes are. Those are the four boxes. Now, the best situation for both of us would be pacifism, because we would both then be able to develop our own resources. We would not be suffering casualties and destruction, and that would be the best choice. The worst choice is for both of us to be warlike. So the numbers here are trying to describe the quality of the choices. So in this box over here, here we are over here, our own choices. We can be pacifist or we can be aggressor. And here are the others' choices, pacifist or aggressor. Now, the score that each one gets is, in the dark color, is for us, our own choices. For the gray color is for the others. So let's just look at our own choices here. If we are pacifist, and the other choice is pacifist, that's great. And then we're going to have peace, and we get 5 points. The other one, he gets peace and 5 points. Or they get peace and 5 points. On the other hand, if we choose to be pacifist, and the other chooses to be the aggressor, here's what our score is in dark. Terrible. Defeat. Minus 100. Because actually, in a lot of these struggles of early human beings, it was all or nothing. Everybody, like Genghis Khan, he slaughtered all the men. So, terrible result here. Minus 100. And on the other hand, if we choose to be the aggressor while the other chooses to be pacifist, we just flip our roles. Now we get the victory, we get 10 points, but the other guy gets a defeat of minus 100. I didn't mention that the other guy got a plus 10 up here when we got the minus 100 because we were pacifist and he was aggressor. And the final one is where we're both aggressors, we both do terribly. Not quite as bad as minus 100 when you get defeated because you're a pacifist. But if we're both aggressive, we don't have very good scores either. So you ask yourself, what is the reasonable course of action one should take? Well, the answer is, if you get 10, if you look at your choices here, here's your score. If I am pacifist up here, I'll get a 5. If I get a victory here, I'll get a 10. If I get a defeat over here, I'll get a minus 100. Terrible. War, minus 50. Look at all the choices. This is the best choice. Be the aggressor. Your best choice is not to be pacifist, be aggressive. And if you look at world politics today, that's a very strong orientation that we have. And for the other guy, it's just the mirror image of the same thing. Look at your, if you're the other guy, you look at your choices. Here you get 5 points for peace, you get 10 points for victory when the other guy's a pacifist. That's your highest score. Terrible, terrible. So both sides agree to be aggressive. And this is called the pacifist's dilemma. I think it's a very simple mathematical model, and it carries a lot of intuitive information about why we behave the way we do. It's because you can't be assured that the other person will cooperate and be a pacifist when you are. Because you can't be sure, you protect yourself. And when you do that, you lower the level of the whole civilization because we're going to have conflict. So let's try to see how this works in a little more detail now. What this is really all about is if we have an individual or a group that's facing another individual or a group, if you aggressively try to take from that group or hurt that group, they're going to want to retaliate. So you have this cycle of aggression and retaliation. And it's symmetrical. Both of them are doing it. Now, some of you might say, well, wait a minute. If we both cooperate, then we could have a beneficent society where both would prosper. And this is where you say, well, what about the fact that there are good guys and bad guys? Some people are good, like us, and other people are bad guys, like North Koreans and Iranians and Islamist militants, and on and on. And if you happen to be in Iran, you will, if you're an ordinary citizen, just like you folks here are, will think that the United States is a very dangerous country. It's the bad guy, and they are the good guys. Similarly for all the other countries. Now, that doesn't mean that some times in history and some leaders of countries haven't been quite malicious and quite nasty. That doesn't rule that out. But the bulk of the population participates in the war, carries on with the war, and it's not just because there are some bad apples. And I'll like to demonstrate that. Here's our New Guinea Highland guys. Who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? If a man from Mars came down and was watching the Second World War, hovering over Europe, like at Google Earth or some satellite, and watching the war, would that man from Mars be able to figure out who was good and who was bad? So warfare is not about good and bad. It's about something much deeper that's embedded in the competitive nature of the way human beings have evolved. So, back to Thomas Hobbes. Here's what he says. Well, all right. So we've got this situation where aggression and retaliation seem to want to, because of the pacifist dilemma, seem to be what we've got. I propose that we should think about a powerful state as Leviathan, a very powerful force that is stronger than any individual citizen, stronger than any individual group, and can come down on these to individuals or groups and say, you aggress and you're going to be punished. You retaliate and you're going to be punished. I am going to be the bigger force and I'm going to enforce behavior. You can also think of it as like acting like an umpire or an impartial judge. And so things change now when we look at how Leviathan can change our pacifist's dilemma. So the piece stays the same. We don't change. Leviathan doesn't change anything on that. But Leviathan says, I'm going to impose a penalty if you choose aggression. So here's the 10 points you got when I didn't enter the picture. Now that I'm here, you're going to lose 15 points because I'm going to punish you. And so now this thing is only worth -5 before it was worth 10. Same thing over here. What was worth 10 before, this guy gets punished because now he's -5. And if you make war, and you both want to make war, I'm going to even make it worse. You're going to lose 150 points on top of the 50 points you already lost. -200. And you can think of the points here as somehow measuring or being a kind of measure of the level of flourishing of the society. So you're going to flourish at a lot lower level. Or if the number's high, you're going to flourish at a higher level. So when we look at the numbers now, we've got 5 here. Now we have -5 over here where we used to have 10. So peace beats aggression, and pacifist beats aggression over here. So peace wins. And it wins because Leviathan came in to impose penalties on those who were aggressive. So now let's look at Leviathan a little bit. So how does Leviathan actually come into being? Well, what happens, if you look at the history of just about all civilizations, whether they be European or Chinese or Asian or even the Americas, the number of small-time warlords, say in the 8th or 9th century after the barbarian invasion of Europe, there's lots of them. And they're all over the place, and they're each controlling their own little river valley or their own little territory. But then some of them get stronger than others, and then the knights who were originally gathered around one little warlord say, we're going to go with the big guy over there in that next valley because he's doing better, so we'll throw our lot in with him. And then the number of independent warring groups goes down, and the number of warring groups, the size of them gets bigger. So now you have powerful barons. And one of the most powerful barons is going to actually then say, well, I'm so powerful, I'm going to get a couple of other barons and say, I'm going to be the king. You want to go along with that? And then I'm going to give you some favors. We're going to collect taxes from our serfs. You're going to collect taxes. I'm going to distribute them. We're going to have a standing army. None of these other small little outfits are going to have a chance against us. And you start to develop from these princely and baronial states, you develop a kingly state with a king. And he has other barons around him and aristocrats and many relatives. It's kind of still a bit of a family affair. So these people now have force of arms to impose on the populace their rule and to stop any wannabe warlord from arising. Now what happens? Well, unfortunately, what happens is the intensity and cruelty of state violence goes up. There's going to be cruel and unusual torture and executions that come about because of this. But the number of violent clashes decreases because the number of warring petty barons and all has been eliminated. But the prevention of such people arising becomes a very big preoccupation of the king and the royalty. Before I bring Samuel Pepys on stage here, in the Bible, in the book of Samuel, you have the whole story of the competition between Saul, who is the Israelite king, and a newcomer who shows up on the scene named David. And David is eventually going to become king, and he is contesting with Saul. But the thing about Saul is he's already inherited and established himself as the royal one, as the king, and we learn from the Bible that David is just a shepherd. He's a nobody. But there are lots of nobodies who are very smart and very skillful, and in fact very skillful at acquiring power. And David gets a gang of guys around him. He's pretty soon a bigger guy than Saul, and he eventually becomes the king of the Israelites. So the same thing can happen here with this Leviathan. He's say the King of England. He's got things under control, but there are bubbling up from underneath contenders. So how do you stop those contenders? So Samuel Pepys, who anybody ever heard of Samuel Pepys? Okay, he was a diarist, a very literary man of 17th century England, and he's actually holding in his hand here, I just noticed this in his portrait, he's holding a piece of music. So he was obviously a musician as well. But he kept a diary of everything that happened in London. Write it up. And I'm sorry, I meant to bring it so I could read it to you, but here's what he said to the best of my recollection. He said, some entry in 1652. I went to Charing Cross today to witness the execution and disembowelment of General Harrison. He presented himself a fine figure, and as much could be expected under the circumstances. He was taken up and hung and cut down, and he was disemboweled, and his heart, his intestines were burned they were cut out while he was still alive. He wasn't hung till he was dead. And his heart was removed, and then finally all his limbs and his head. And when the heart was held up to the crowd, a great cheer went up. So that's what Pepys writes, to the best of my recollection. And here is, just in case you want some evidence, this is what things were like during this period of this transition when Leviathan was just trying to stomp on everybody and prevent anybody from going against his absolute rule. So this is a scene in which somebody is being disemboweled and his limbs cut up. In China, they did this also. This is a worldwide phenomenon. I'm kind of curious how everybody, I guess it's because human body has 4 limbs and a head. That's what people thought, well, that's what we'll do to scare people. And then the limbs were taken to various important cities, Bristol, London, and so on, and hung up as a sign and identified as to who it was. In the 17th century, well, beginning in the 14th and continuing on through the 17th and even into the, particularly in the 15th, London Bridge, very famous bridge in London. Of course, there's a new bridge now. But London Bridge was a very important way that people got from one side of the Thames to the other. The opponents of the king and the reigning party were, when they were beheaded, they were stuck, the heads were stuck on pikes, and they were put up on London Bridge. So if you're the citizen taking your apples to market or whatever, you would see the heads of people like Sir Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, General Harrison. One of the visitors who also kept a diary said, I was on London Bridge this morning and I counted 30 heads. And sometimes the heads would be tarred so they wouldn't decompose so rapidly. And the limbs would be sent to their other cities. This upsurge in cruelty is a kind of feeble human attempt to intimidate and frighten and scare people. But I don't think it was terribly effective. There was still plenty of opposition. When the revolution, well, let's follow this a little bit. So here's, you got the Leviathan and the royalty and the aristocrats and the kings bearing down on the populace, which is mostly impoverished. These are just serfs and landsmen. They are not. The king's party and the Leviathan group are always at the top of the heap. So as time goes on, this is time going on here, the populace is growing and staying in poverty. Since the royal party and the aristocrats that are clustered around the king are a small group, they're still a small group. But this group is very unhappy. Now the reason for that is the Leviathan is not impartial. The Leviathan turns out to have his own selfishness and corruption and infighting among the various groups that are holding the Leviathan together. And what happens is there's going to be a revolution. The populace is going to rise up. And in Britain, this was a very famous time in Britain of the British Civil War in the 17th century, when a commoner named Oliver Cromwell, a distant relative of the Thomas Cromwell whose head was on the bridge, Oliver Cromwell was going to end up on the bridge too, eventually, rose up and actually managed to overthrow the king. Now, the British politics were a little more complicated at this time. There was a parliament that dates back to around the 14th century, which kind of evolved from what was called the Privy Council. So the king could not rule completely on his own. He's just one man. He's got to somehow get others around him. So the Privy Council was a way to pull in some other powerful lords. And then the Parliament was a way to broaden that. So Parliament and the king are kind of dancing around each other, exerting power. And Cromwell came to power by bringing the Parliament to his side, and actually they overthrew the king for a while. What happens? Well, let me just finish the story. Cromwell then, there's still great dissatisfaction in the country. The Puritans, who Cromwell was the leader of, and you know the Puritans who came to America came during this time because they were discriminated against by the aristocracy and the Leviathan parties, because Leviathan wasn't the impartial keeper of the peace. Leviathan had his own agenda and was feathering his own nest. So the Puritans left and came to America at that time. But there was still great unrest because the Puritans were not such great people themselves either. They had the same kinds of selfishness and infighting, and eventually Cromwell was overthrown, and they brought back the king. They brought back a king who had fled to Scotland. And at that point then Cromwell was arrested and tried and beheaded. So the reigning power is the one that is trying to impose the atrocities that will scare people into behaving. And so I've been describing what went on in England, but similar kinds of struggles between the populace and the king and the royals and the aristocrats who are gathered around the king took place in all these European countries. Not all at the same time, but there was about 400 years of civil and religious war from about 1400 to about the middle of the 18th century. And that's what was going on. It's because Leviathan is still human. Leviathan still has his own selfishness. He's not what Hobbes thought he would be. And I just mentioned in passing that religion played a big part in this. Cromwell was a Protestant. And there was a very big struggle where Protestants and Catholics lined up on either side of this divide. So religion becomes one of the tags, one of the markers, one of the ways people identify themselves and group together under religion. So we go into this cycle of new Leviathan. The new Leviathan can also eventually get corrupt and selfish. And as time goes on, you saw that violence curve was declining. It was declining. And that's because at each step, there was a little more civility that came into a realization that you can't just step on people and take from them. You've got to incorporate the general population more into the decision-making process of the society. So from the Privy Council that I mentioned, we have a parliament. Then you can have finally a representative democracy and a judiciary that can resolve disputes about what the law is. So in the evolution of Leviathan, this is sort of what it comes down to. We kind of have parliaments and representative democracies today and judiciary. In China, we have this party Congress, which is, it's not really a democracy, but there's a whole bunch of people that get together and sort of hash it out. And that's where they stand. And I put a question mark because I don't know what comes next. I want to show something interesting about this upsurge of cruelty and upsurge of violence. This is very recent now. This is what I call the 20th century Leviathan effect. We're looking at time here. We're going from 1940, so this is very recent, to 2010. And this is the kind of government that countries have. So this is the number of countries, and we have three different kinds of government here. The two extremes are democracies and autocracies. And there's a new term that people who study politics have introduced in the last couple of decades called anocracies. These are governments that are not democratic, but they're not completely authoritarian either. They are kind of in transition. So, why did the number of countries that were autocracies suddenly shoot up like crazy during the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s? What was going on? What was going on is the Western powers in Europe gave up their colonies in Africa and America, Latin America, and in a few other places, other parts of the world. When Leviathan left, Leviathan now, in the case of those colonies, was the controlling force. When he pulled out, then Thomas Hobbes says, well, this is what you can expect. People go back to the natural state. They go back, and you are going to have to build up an autocracy to get them to behave. But it was a fairly short burst. And some of these, the Idi Amins and the various dictators that came to power in Africa have all slowly been leaving the scene. And the number of autocracies has gone down, the number of democracies has gone up, and the so-called anocracies have kind of bounced around in the middle. Can there be a top-level Leviathan? That's a very important question. Is there somebody that's going to get Leviathan to behave? A bigger Leviathan who makes Leviathan do his job justly and fairly. The United Nations is not Leviathan so far, and I'm not about to enter the debate about whether it can be or should be. I'm just making the observation. I just want to look briefly at other civilizing forces now. This is the kind of main theme about war and violence. I'm going to look at three things: commerce, feminization, the women's movement, and the last one, which may surprise you, evolving brain and mind, which means the way we reason and think and the way we solve problems is actually probably rather different, and we have more capacity for doing that than people did, say, 200 or 300 years ago, and certainly 1,000 years ago. So this is not exactly a biological phenomenon, because we have essentially the brain that our ancestors had 200,000 years ago. But it is a way in which the social situation can use what's there and rewire it in a slightly different way. So let's look at one of these. Here's commerce. So now if you've got people that are involved in the pacifist dilemma, they're going to now have commerce. They're going to trade with one another. So now we're not going to change the kind of things that Leviathan was changing. We don't change these guys. But over here on this peace square, we get profit because of the commerce. And we'll be good businessmen. We'll throw in 100 points for commerce. So now peace is worth 105, and it greatly outdoes aggression. So that's a way in which commerce can solve or resolve the prisoners, the pacifist's dilemma. Feminization, the role of women. This is non-trivial, and as you know, Anna Zilborg and I gave a talk on women last month that dealt with this. Have attitudes changed? This appeared.
I'm not yaying for this, I'm yaying for feminization.
Oh. This is an ad that appeared in national magazines, including Life magazine in 1952. Do you think it could appear in a national magazine today? The women's movement is, I think, a very important force here. It's not trivial. And we can look at the pacifist dilemma now. The 5 points for peace stays the same. The minus 50 for war stays the same. It's the same for both. But these are the sensitive squares in the pacifist dilemma, the ones where one is aggressor and the other is pacifist. So in this case, we have victory without glory. Which that means is you get 10 points for victory, but we're going to take away 8 because we don't think it's a good thing. We don't think it's a good thing to be an aggressor and go in and win territory. This is not a good thing. we're going to penalize you for that, and the women are going to penalize you for being aggressive to do that. So now that's only worth 2 points. Another possibility is defeat without humiliation. Several psychologists have found that men fear defeat and loss more than they value winning. And this is true in sports and other competitive kinds of things, not just warfare. You don't want to be a loser. That's more frightening. So you will do everything you can to not lose. Well, when we still have football games, like the Dallas Cowboys, they have, I guess all these teams have, scantily clad women who are cheering them on and saying, my hero, smash them. I will reward you with my great affection and I will stay with you. To the extent that women say, you're not my hero. You're a schmuck. And you shouldn't do that. So there's defeat without humiliation. You can lose, and women are not going to penalize you for it. They're not going to think badly of you. They're going to, in fact, think more positively of you because you took the pacifist course. Okay, now we come to a really interesting one. This is the last one I'll talk about. Let's see. The modern evolution of the brain's ability for mutual cooperation in resolving the pacifist dilemma. We are getting smarter, but it doesn't mean we're getting more intelligent, and that's a very important distinction. But we are getting smarter. What I'm saying is, there's a very fine mathematician named Douglas Hofstadter who did the column in Scientific American. He took over from Martin Gardner. And he was discussing the pacifist dilemma when it first came out. This would be back in the early 1980s. And he said, now wait a minute. I'm staring at this thing. I'm seeing that if we both cooperate, we're both going to do better. So why aren't we doing that? Are we not thoughtful, capable, look at the situation, come to that conclusion? Any intelligent person looks at it and says, here's the points for being the aggressor, here's the points for both being pacifists, you win. I choose that. Why aren't they choosing that? And it's an interesting question. Why wouldn't you make the intelligent choice? Well, it might be that people are not able, they're not intelligent enough to do it. They're not smart enough to do it. Here's a really amazing thing. This is an effect that was discovered by James Flynn. It's called the Flynn effect. He looked at IQ scores IQ tests are now, for the last 50 years have been all over the place, all cultures, all countries, China, Europe, Latin America, everybody does IQ tests. And they almost more or less follow the same form. You've all seen IQ tests, so matching words, interpreting a paragraph, and so on. And so the reason James Flynn got onto this was he found that the people who make up the tests, every 10 years or so, they'd have to change the tests. They'd have to make up new tests because the scores kept creeping up. So they'd make a new test a little harder. But then that one would creep up. And so Flynn correlated all this material, and from virtually every literate culture that has schools and has universities and so on. And what he found was that the average gain in IQ points is like up as high as 30 points Very significant. But here's the real, so here's the raw IQ score. It's only up by about 15 points. But he broke it down into two different categories. There are problems in the IQ test that are about pattern matching, about the detection of relationships, how something is related to something else, about causality, how something could cause something else. There are questions like that, and I'll give you an example of one. Well, let's see, I'm going to try to... That class of question, the pattern question, the question about causality, the question about relationship, those questions, which are called matrices and similarities, I'll tell you why they're called that shortly. But I want to point out that they are the ones that did all the rise. People, students, developed greater capacity to detect relationships between things and patterns and causalities. That if you do this, that's going to do that. What's really interesting, I think, is general IQ related to how many facts you know, information, and even simple arithmetic, how to add numbers, subtract numbers, and vocabulary, how many fancy words you know. That score didn't change. What changed was this ability to detect patterns and relationships. Here's an example. So you're given this test. And what this test consists of is sequences that are moving from left to right. And there are three different ones here. So each one is a story unto itself. So here's the first story. You've got vertical lines and two dots. You've got diagonal lines and two dots. And now you've got curved lines, principally horizontal, with four dots. Okay, all right. Here's the next guy. You've got vertical lines with a diagonal bar. You've got horizontal lines with a horizontal bar aligned with the lines. And now you've got the curve with both bars superimposed. So then, now you've got horizontal and horizontal vertical squares, horizontal diagonal squares, and vertical. What should that be? So what is the answer? Now, the answer is one of these 8 possibilities. Okay. 7. 7 it is. 7 it is. Did the women all get it and the men didn't?
That was what I was good at.
Yes? Well,
I know when I took the
yes.
original. Decades ago.
Now, I think that's rather important, and I'm going to perhaps, you can criticize me for perhaps stretching this a little bit, but social intelligence that can rally troops to defeat competitors relies on political rhetoric. That relies on knowing what kind of terms will excite people. It involves knowing lots of facts so that if you're debating with somebody, you can clobber him with some more facts. The other one is perception and understanding of social forces in play to effect cooperation for greater good of competing interests. And I think that's very largely got a scientific coloring to it. I'm not saying that's what science is. I'm saying that's thinking more like a scientist. The politicians have this kind of intelligence. But this is the kind we need for the future. And maybe they'll slowly get it. I think. So, there's the pacifist dilemma. Will future generations resolve it? Continue the resolution that we've got going? The great decline in violence that has occurred? I don't know. And I'm going to stop there. Say we could have discussion or questions now. I guess?
Yeah.
Yes?
Just going back to your previous chart, think of somebody saying, and I don't remember, no, the one after that, don't bother me with the facts.
Yes, 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 yes. Well, or having lots of facts that you can marshal to push the competitive, because you're trying to defeat the other person. You're not trying to cooperate with them. You want to defeat him.
If my facts are good enough, it will.
Yeah. Well, I'll probably really anger some people right now, but I think of two particular human beings that are on the stage. Well, actually, one of them's dead now. But I think of, does anybody know who William F. Buckley is? Does anybody know who Steven Pinker is? Nobody knows who Steven Pinker is?
Oh.
Steven Pinker? Yeah. Well, William F. Buckley is a very smart man. And he is devastating in debate. He is very smooth. He epitomizes, I think, the politician who knows how to use intelligence to rally people together and to defeat other people. Steven Pinker is a contemporary psychologist. Psychology is actually his field. But he has written about the mind and language. He also is very interested in language. And his recent book, which I took a lot of my curves, my graphs from, fortunately he did all the work, or students working with him did all the work, is called Our Better Angels.
The better angels of our nature.
Better Angels of Our Nature, the decline, or the something or other. But at any rate, I think of Steven Pinker is a very thoughtful scientist. He understands a lot of physics. He understands a lot of psychology. He has acquainted himself with neuroanatomy and the emotional system and how it works. And I sort of put him as sort of the counterpoint to the William F. Buckley kind of intelligence. I think the hope of the future is more in the Pinker type analysis, which says we have a serious problem. We have competing interests that have different values. How do we put those together for the best result? And I think that's the kind of thing we need. And we're not there yet. Any other questions? Yes?
Well, just on a minuscule level, this sort of reminds me of our current gun control.
Absolutely.
That's happening right
Absolutely.
now. It's too opposing, and it's very political.
Yes.
And that's the rhetoric that we're
Yes.
hearing.
Mm-hmm. And also you see people who are wanting to have some gun control are seeing that it's a problem when men, programmed the way men are, have a great passion. They thrill to weapons that can fire off a lot of ammunition at once. It's the same as when they stomp on the throttle of a motorcycle and it's just, there's men love that. And the NRA is full of people, not completely, but the ones who have the voice, the ones who give their public image. And nobody's going to take their guns away because that's, in fact, these are pre-Leviathan people. They want to say, I will tell you what to do. You're not going to tell me what to do. I've got a gun and I'll tell you what to do.
Also, there are a lot of women who love that firing off those multiple rounds. The ones that I know.
Can you speak up a little louder? I can't hear you.
There are also women who love to fire off those rounds. The ones who I know of who do it at range, on ranges.
Right. No, I'm sure that there are women who get that thrill too. There's a whole interesting discussion about what the differences between female and male psychology are. And there are women who think like men, and there are men who think like women because of the way their brains were actually formed. Yes?
David, your charts of the pacifist dilemma, where did those numbers come from?
They were made up.
Oh, okay. So in other words, they could be changed any way anybody wants.
Yeah, you could. The takeaway from that is not the value of the number. It's that, for example, let's go back and look at one. Okay. Let's look at, let's look at this. Well, let's look at that one. Commerce. If you're going to have peace plus profit, somehow that one's got to go up because there's a dividend. If you're going to cooperate peacefully, you're going to be more productive. Your factories are not going to be bombed. Your fields are not going to be ravaged. They're not going to tear out all your olive trees, both sides losing all their olive trees. So that square has got to go up. The payoff's got to go up.
Doesn't that depend on who the winner and the loser is?
They're both the winner. That's the whole point. They both won. They won more than they would have gotten had they become the aggressor.
Well, that's where I wonder where those numbers come from.
Doesn't make any difference.
The precise value of the number doesn't make any difference. The fact that it went up is what makes the difference. The both choosing the pacifist option raised the payoff for both of them. That's the important point.
So you don't think the aggressor's profits would have gone up because of war?
No, because there's not going to be any. The commerce is going to be smashed. You're not going to be able to do any trading.
You spend it on bombs and bullets.
Did our profits go up because we went to war in Iraq and Afghanistan? No, they went down.
No, they broke the country.
Military and industrial complex.
Are you getting it, Steve?
Not really. I mean, I see a lot of, throughout history, I think a lot of people have made a lot of money, in wars.
But they could have made more money if they hadn't done that. Or let's put it this way, more people could have made more money.
Well, I agree with that. I agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Which, for me, comes back to, for me, the role of religion, and especially Judeo-Christian, where you have the value of human beings changing from Cain and Abel, which we know stands for the farmer and the hunter and the fight over land, the essential selfishness of people doing things in their own best interest, and being taught and persuaded that it is more in their best interest to benefit not only themselves but benefit the other, and then especially by the time you get to the New Testament, to Jesus Christ, you have the value that there is a value on individual human life. Number one, you have the value that of trying to comprehend that every person is made in the image of God and therefore has value. And that if that's true, then how does that affect our behavior toward the other? The other becomes my brother instead of the other.
I had to cut this at some point. I couldn't include everything, but I actually did want to say something about that. One of the other, in the civilizing forces that I mentioned, let's go back to the end here.
I noticed there was a lack of the word religion up there, and then I thought about the Crusades.
Well, there have been horrendous things done in the name of religion.
All religions have participated in violence.
That's right.
And torture and you name it. Let's see here. Where are we? I thought I had a slide. Oh, okay. So that's evolution of the brain's ability for mutual cooperation in resolving that the brain and the mind and the social environment in which they all exist is changing. It's not a biological genetic change, but it uses the basic equipment that genetics has given us, and it can move in certain directions. You can't turn things completely upside down, but you can move them. One of the things that is notable about religion is that it's a leviathan. Religion is a kind of a leviathan. Leviathan will put you in hell if you don't do the right thing. So religion has this super force that is pressing down, forcing people to behave. The fear of hell. Or we'll burn you at the stake if you cross us. And within the circle of a given religion, like Christianity, or over here, Islam, there is great beneficence. People are motivated to be enormously generous and caring, to be helpful, to be loving. Within the circle, it's very profound what religion accomplishes.
There's also been the side of the emphasis on knowledge, on gaining knowledge and wisdom within the various religions as well, which has to do with how you interpret what you learn.
Well, the point I want to make is outside the circle. Here is the Christian circle. Here's the Islam circle over here. It cuts off. Those are infidels. These are enemies of God over here. They deserve to be slaughtered, or at least ignored, or at least struggled against, or told that they're in error. So what's very striking about religion, and I'm not sure people within most religions are aware of how sharp that boundary is when you go out of the tradition and you now have to confront large parts of humanity that are in a different tradition. So one of the...
There's also been the confusion of religion with faith and relationship. Even Jesus said, I have sheep not of this pasture.
Well, that's another dimension.
That's a whole other, yeah.
But the idea now is that the next step, which is kind of happening, is that this boundary that stops, say, with Catholicism or Christianity or Islam or Hinduism is going to expand. And it has to expand so that all of humanity is contained inside the same circle. And that is the idea of a philosopher named Peter Singer. I mean, he's not the only one, but he's written about it, of the expanding circle. The circle of parochialism and exclusiveness expands to be all-inclusive.
I'm just thinking of two modern examples of the upper left-hand box, the win-win box. And one was both in 79, when the Czechoslovakia broke up into Slovakia and the Czech Republic, the Velvet Revolution. When the Berlin Wall came down, the reunification of East and West Germany. I mean, those are just two examples of how that's the way to go rather than fight over it.
Mm-hmm. Yes?
I was just thinking, looking at past this dilemma, that one of the impeding factors in both taking the passive side is distrust. For instance, if I meet my swords and plowshares, I don't have anything to defend myself if you attack me later on.
Well, that's exactly what it's saying. Yeah, that's correct. That's why you choose aggression. That's the whole point. But if you, like Douglas Hofstadter, can stare at this thing and say, I'm a thoughtful person, I see the problems I face, aren't other people looking and seeing the same thing? Why are we choosing to go for the lower result? I can trust because it is sensible.
Not trusting is a horrible way to live your life.
Yes.
But how many people are indoctrinated with the nonsense of the others? Coming back to your question about...
Think of rebellious teenagers. Indoctrination doesn't work all the time, you know. You can't sustain it.
Pretty successful, though. It's been pretty successful in terms of maintaining the regime.
You know, it works pretty well until things go wrong.
Coming back to your increase in intelligence, do you think that's attributable to the breakdown of ideologically based
You're talking about the Flynn effect?
Yeah, about the breakdown in narrow categorical thinking that's taken place in the last 50 or 60 years? I mean, I was raised on a whole menu of stereotypes, which are now totally irrelevant, which our children and grandchildren basically wouldn't even understand if we told them about.
Right.
In terms of these social relationships, the breakdowns of stereotypes and some of these absurd ideologies, do you think that that's been a factor in the changing?
Well, I definitely think it's related. Yes. Yeah. You know, and in fact, it encodes something that's very fundamental to lots of religions, which is the golden rule. That person over there has body and soul like me. That he bleeds and he suffers and he has hopes and dreams, or she, just like me. That symmetry of that prisoner's dilemma is kind of blinking lights off and on like that.
Well, the passive aggressive, you have to have some way to take World War II. If the United States tried to be passive for a long time, and if they stayed that way, they would have been run over.
Well, that's the whole point. That's exactly what it's saying. And you're going to stay in that state. And this is what Hobbes said. Hobbes said, it's brutish, terrible, and short. You want to stay there? Well, then you're going to stay there until you develop a capacity to learn how to cooperate with other people.
Well, would some of this be possible because back in the early days, they were just trying to stay alive? And today, we're not really worried necessarily about staying alive. We have, take vacations.
Well, there's another way to say it, too. It's that life is cheap.
Well, that's correct.
You know, if you have a community and you have two people vying for a leadership position, and one of them takes the stand, when you have this top statement versus the bottom statement, people scream at us. But one of them takes a stand. He is a very good orator and really can stir up a crowd with just rhetoric. We've got to go over there and beat them because they're going to come over and beat us, and we don't do that first. They're going to get us. Right. That type of person versus the other person stands up saying deeply. He says, I've got this graph here. I want to show it. I want to explain it to you. And up here we have this, and this is something like that graph right there. Which one's going to get the crowd behind him? And I think
the times might be changing. The times might be changing. It may not happen in my lifetime or my children's lifetimes, but look at the direction in which this has been going.
I hope so. Yeah. But you're talking to I'm going to make our heads swell, but you're talking to a group that wants to listen to this. How many people are in the counties around us that aren't here?
I think we underestimate people in Russia who look at what's going on and say, this is just a big mistake.
I tend to believe that the populace in the countries that are our perceived enemies, the general populace is not our enemies, it's the people running things. I've read articles about people.
Yes, that's true, but we are socially programmed to go along. People observe that. The policies of the government are not my policies.
And don't you feel that the internet today, Facebook, internet, and everything is breaking down those walls? I mean,
Come to the next lecture.
Yeah.
Yes, the next lecture is going to be, I think the next lecture is on the Global Information Society.
February the 17th.
From the point at which knowledge and literacy became valued. And
Yes,
that's
and jumps
women
across
too,
across governments and religious boundaries, jumps across citizen to citizen. Now, it might have other pitfalls that we don't know about, but nonetheless, it's a wild time.
Well, that's why literacy is so important worldwide, and why there's so much talk about how the education of women and children changes a culture.
Definitely. And it also explains why white men are very upset. Because they got power and status for free. They didn't have to be particularly creative. They didn't have to be particularly good at anything. They could, just like an adolescent male chimpanzee when he is entering the age of puberty, what that chimpanzee will do is go to every female in the troop and smack her. And that means that he's boss. And she's going to be secondary. Until the females gang up together. Yes?
So, dude, what happens to all this when people get hungry?
Maybe they perish.
And they don't.
Maybe a few selfish people. Maybe a few selfish people survive.
They choose that over violence.
What's that?
They choose that over violence. They choose to give up. In other words, rather than
Probably not. Probably not.
That's what's happening now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what precipitated it. I think anyway, like history recalls correctly, that's what happened in World War II. Where the Germans actually, under Hitler's, he became popular because they were they were starving. Yeah, they were really having a hard time, and so he came and said, "Listen, we can change things here," and it seems to me that's basically how it all started with Germany with World War II. So in other words, my concept is that when people get hungry, they do desperate things.
You can stay down in the worst parts of the pacifist dilemma.
I'm not advocating it. I'm just.
Well, you're saying that's reality, and if you think that that's reality forever.
Well, I don't know forever. I'm just saying that in terms of historic history, it seems like when people get hungry, they.
There's no doubt about self-interest is very dominant in all of the political interactions that take place today. There's no doubt about it. But you can see fingers of cooperation. You can see little fissures in the cracks of people who want it all their way. They see that there's got to be more cooperation.
Well, that's what I think it's possible. I guess that's what we're talking about today.
And maybe you'll produce more food if you cooperate than if you don't. And maybe if you cooperate, you can cut the birth rate, which is really a very important thing.
Your example there was right on target for one of your charts where it had retribution, because that problem in Germany was caused by the retribution of the victors in World War I. The Versailles Treaty caused that.
It's just part of the same cycle. It's it's almost pointless to talk about cause and effect, except on a very small scale, that this particular event did that. But the people often just try to argue that this is the cause. The reason that this happened is because you caused it. And it's so evident with children. Two little kids were in a fight. I happen to have for many years when I first moved to Meadows with Dan, I have relationships with people in monasteries the Trappists in Kentucky, particularly, was one that I was close to. And it's common, both in churches and in monasteries, to have what are called the Stations of the Cross. And this is a sort of Catholic, Episcopal, Lutheran ritual. It's the 12 events in the Passion of Christ, from the time of being condemned to death to being laid in the tomb. And usually there's sculpture or artwork or stained glass, and it goes around a cathedral. And I put in a set of crosses that I made that were hand-hewn out of locust, and they go around the fields of my place. And during right before Easter, we generally would invite people and we would have an event following them, and I would prepare readings for them. The last of which was, in fact, the writings of Etty Hillesum, who was a Jewish woman in Holland, who kept a journal of her whole trial of being under the Nazis and finally being forced to go to camp and finally ending up in Auschwitz. But she recorded the whole experience. And I used that as the reading. She's not a Christian, she was a Jew, but I thought of it as right on for the Passion of Christ. Here it is, right here. At any rate, I don't want to get distracted. We had a visitor, young boy, very precocious kid, about 9, 10 years old. And he was visiting, it wasn't during one of the ceremonies. And we were taking a walk, and we passed one of the crosses. And John ran up to it and was looking at it. And so we said, well, John, give us a prayer. And so he looked at the cross and he said, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Okay, I think we need to probably continue with more private discussions. Is there one more?
I just had a thought in response to hunger, because it seems to me a lot of the revolutions began or were a result of, or that was a big component of it.
Certainly the Russian Revolution is a very big part of it.
The French Revolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that just...
It's called what you reap what you don't sow. Okay. Yes. Yes.
I don't know if it's going to be too subtle or it would be a sort of...
You speak very mildly. You can...
I do. Project better. No, I get real worried when I hear people talking about the way things have been. They'll start to say things, well, that's the way things always have been. And then they'll say, that's just the way things are. And they use these opinions about what they take to be human nature as being immutable, and they use that as a justification for their own continued behavior, which continues this cycle. So I worry about people's beliefs about what has been the case, or their predictions about what will always be the case in the future, as itself being a component to our own self-defeating disaster.
There is a natural process that is important. It's death. People go off stage. People who hold opinions and values of an era are slowly going off stage. New people are being born into the circumstances of the present and the problems of the present, and will try to deal with them and grapple with appropriate techniques and policies. And the ones who are in the past are slowly going off stage. It's very important that we go off stage.
Because we're on stage as politicians.
But see, I absolutely agree with you. But again, for me personally, and I'm just speaking personally, that's the hope of the Judeo-Christian faith and other faiths in in understanding that the other is like me and that I can have a relationship with others and with God, is that's really a very revolutionary thing. That's a very revolutionary thing. And therefore opens up the possibility that real and lasting change and transformation is possible. So that's where hope is for me.
Sure, and all of these beneficent things that have evolved within religion and people have enormous amount of experience with, they have a set of emotional reactions that are biased towards love within. If that circle can just expand, those same things that are already present in dealing beneficently with fellow human beings within your religion can find a larger setting
outside of your own.
Yeah, so that the whole circle expands. I think that's that metaphor of the expanding circle, I think is a very important one. Okay, there are snacks and things. I think we're going to end here.